Welcome to Historic Lullabies. I'm so glad you're here. Whether this is your first time listening or you've been with us before, thank you for joining us tonight, where the past hums softly just beneath the surface of your thoughts. Wherever you are right now, nestled into warm blankets, resting your head in the stillness of evening, or simply seeking a gentle moment of calm, know that you are warmly invited to tonight's story. Tonight, we'll drift slowly into the golden candlelight of a forgotten feast, a place where roasted lamb glistens beside jeweled rice, and silence speaks louder than words, a place where every gesture means something, where even a spoon can hold the weight of ceremony, and where bread isn't simply torn, it is honored. Yes, tonight we're stepping into the world of ancient Persian dining, not just what people ate, but how they behaved while doing it. It may sound like a simple curiosity, but I have to warn you, just a little. I hope this story helps you relax, maybe even drift off to sleep. But it might also be a bit too peculiar, a bit too vivid, or a bit too delicious to doze through. Still, even if you stay awake, you'll come away with something lovely to whisper over breakfast. Perhaps a dreamy story about the man whose only job was to pass the water, without ever being seen. Before we float too far into the quiet corners of the past, a gentle like or subscribe would mean a lot, and helps Historic Lullabies keep growing quietly. And if you'd like, you're always welcome to share where in the world you're listening from, and what time of night it is there. It's always comforting to know how far this little journey can reach. Now, let's take one soft breath together, in and out. Imagine a desert evening, quiet and amber-colored, the air thick with the scent of roasted eggplant and mint. You are seated on a soft cushion embroidered in gold thread. The floor beneath you is cool, polished stone. Before you is a low table carved from fragrant cedar, and upon it rests a single dish, untouched, for now. In the court of the Achaemenids, rulers of a vast and ancient Persian empire, a meal was never simply a meal. It was a performance, a ritual, a quiet test of knowledge, self-control, and grace. And though the food was sumptuous, the rules were stranger than fiction. You weren't just expected to know what to eat. You were expected to know when to look up, where to place your spoon, how to tear your bread, even who to glance at before you took the first bite. But why such fuss? Why turn something as human and natural as eating into a silent dance of discipline and decorum? To find out, we'll need to go back to the very beginning, centuries before fine porcelain, before forks and formal napkins. The people of Persia saw food as more than fuel. It was a symbol of order, of cosmic balance. They believed that every bite, every movement had meaning, not because they were overly strict, but because they saw the table as sacred space, a place where the body and spirit met quietly over lentils, lamb, and quince. You'll find no loud proclamations at this table, no clinking glasses or uproarious toasts, but in the silence, something else stirs, a kind of reverence, a gentle, glowing mindfulness that turns eating into meditation. And so, you begin to understand, slowly, sleepily, that to dine in ancient Persia was to enter into a world where etiquette and emotion were beautifully entangled, where the shape of a spoon, or the presence of a rose petal on your plate, might say more than words ever could. Tonight, we will walk, or perhaps float, through those customs, not as scholars, not even as guests, but as quiet observers, with soft eyes and an open heart, letting the stories rise up like steam from a warm stew. Just as you begin to wonder how such a meal was prepared, a soft bell sounds from somewhere in the distance, imaginary, yet echoing in the corners of your mind. It's the call that signals dinner is about to begin. The sun has dipped just below the horizon. The first stars blink above the desert, and servants, robed in simple linen, begin to drift silently through the stone halls, lighting small oil lamps one by one. Soon, the room will glow with golden light. The feast will begin. But no one, not even the king, will eat just yet. Because in ancient Persia, timing was everything. And before a single bite is taken, everyone must be seated. Everyone must be still. And so must we. Let's pause here. Let the air settle. Let the anticipation hang like incense on the edge of the night. Because next, we'll watch as the servants arrive with towering platters of jeweled rice, fragrant stews, and flatbreads warm from the stone oven, each dish shimmering like treasure under firelight. But remember, no one reaches out, no one speaks, not yet, because Persian dining didn't begin with the food. It began with the silence. The glow of the oil lamp spread slowly, like warm honey over polished stone. Their flames flicker gently, casting long, quiet shadows that stretch across the floor and walls. The air is rich, not loud, not heavy, just gently filled with the perfume of roasted spices, cardamom, and something sweet that might be figs. You rest your hands in your lap. All around you, the hush of waiting settles. You are no longer just a guest. You are part of the stillness, an honored observer in a world where even the light must behave itself. The table before you isn't tall like a modern dining table. It's low, inviting, almost like it wants you to lean closer and listen. There are no chairs, only wide cushions. Their colors soft from wear, each one stitched with patterns so detailed they feel like lullabies for the eyes. Then they begin to arrive, not people, not yet, but dishes. Enormous silver platters, carried carefully by hands that do not tremble. The servers are barefoot, their steps soundless on the stone. They move like dancers, as though the floor remembers every step taken before. First comes rice, not ordinary rice, but jeweled rice, they call it. It's dotted with slivers of orange peel, scarlet barberries, and green pistachios, each glinting like treasure. The top layer is golden, crisp, and shaped into a soft dome, browned to perfection with saffron. It glows slightly in the lamplight, almost as if it were alive. Then come the stews, bowls of faisandjan, a pomegranate and walnut stew so thick and dark it looks like velvet. Next to it, gourmet sabzi, green and earthy, dotted with red kidney beans that peek out like tiny jewels of their own. The scent of fenugreek hovers just above it all, earthy, unfamiliar, almost nostalgic. And still, no one eats. Because in ancient Persia, food alone did not open the meal. It was the moment, the light, the silence, the rhythm of service that unlocked the evening. Dishes had to arrive in order, and everything had to be present before the first bite was taken. You glance to your right. An older man with a silver-trimmed robe adjusts his cushion just slightly. He doesn't speak, but the server near him bows with a barely visible nod, as if understanding something silent that passed between them. It's not just about food here. It's about grace. Grace in silence. Grace in service. Grace in knowing the next step without being told. The candles have burned a little lower. The scent of rosewater has now mixed with the richness of lamb. Somewhere nearby, a lute begins to play a melody so soft it could be mistaken for memory. And still, not a single word. This was how it was meant to be. In the palaces of Persepolis and Susa, great feasts unfolded like music without sound. Each guest knew their part. Each server played a role. The table itself was a kind of map, where you sat, what was placed before you, even the height of your dish, all spoke volumes about your place in the world. There's a story, passed from one sleepy scholar to another, of a young noble who sat just a little too high on his cushion. His dish was delivered with more rice than usual, and less stew. It was a subtle reminder, a quiet rebalancing of pride. No need for scolding when the spoon could teach instead. Historians still argue whether that story ever truly happened, but the rules of the Persian table were very real, and surprisingly precise. Even the height of the platters mattered. The rice was served higher than the stew, and the bread always placed near the guest's left hand, never the right. A mistaken placement could be seen as an insult, or worse, a breach in the unspoken harmony of the meal. You lean back slightly, your body beginning to soften. The warmth from the oil lamps gently brushes your cheeks. The spices in the air seem to hum quietly in your lungs, coaxing you into stillness. And now, the silverware, or rather, the lack of it. You might expect forks, knives, spoons, the whole clinking choir of modern meals. But not here, not yet. Forks are centuries away from appearing on these tables, and knives, too aggressive for such a gentle ceremony. Instead, there are spoons, beautifully carved, usually of wood, sometimes ivory, reserved for stews and delicate dishes. They rest on small trays beside the food, never touching the table directly. A guest must wait for their spoon to be placed for them. Touching it prematurely would be unthinkably rude. But most dishes are eaten with hands, or, more accurately, with bread, not torn wildly or snapped apart. Persian bread was broken with care, using only the fingertips, never the whole hand. Each piece folded delicately, used to scoop, then lifted with elegant precision. There was no chewing with open mouths, no talking while eating, and absolutely no reaching across the table. You begin to understand how dining here was more like prayer than consumption. It was choreography, reverence, a way to bring balance not just to the stomach, but to the soul. The cushions beneath you shift slightly as another guest settles in. You feel the floor cool beneath your ankles. Someone lights another lamp in the far corner of the room, and its light joins the others, softening, deepening, without drawing attention to itself. And still, no one eats, because the king has not yet arrived. Or perhaps he has, but he waits, not to be served first, but last, not to command, but to observe. He watches to see who honors the rhythm of the table, who understands the silence, who knows that in this room, restraint is the highest form of grace. You close your eyes for a moment, let your breath ease. Let the imagined feast unfold without urgency. You do not need to keep up. You are not being tested. You are simply here, resting beside silver platters, under saffron light, as 1,000 tiny rules move quietly around you like wind across silk. And when the first spoon is lifted, you might miss it, because it makes no sound at all. The moment the first spoon touches stew, it's as though an invisible curtain has lifted. No applause, no fanfare, just the faintest movement of hands, dipping gently into their own portions, each one following an unseen rhythm already centuries old. You might not have noticed at first, but now that the meal has quietly begun, something else becomes clear. No two people sit quite the same. The arrangement isn't random, not in ancient Persia. Who sat where, and beside whom, was a language unto itself. It spoke in silences, in glances, in the distance between dishes. At a royal feast, the seat of highest honor was always to the right of the king, but even that position carried its own burdens. To be seated there was to be watched, to be expected to set the tone, calm, composed, dignified. A single misstep could echo longer than the taste of any stew. You shift softly in your imagined cushion and begin to notice patterns. The eldest guest sits close to the head of the table, their back straight despite their years. To their left, a general whose armor shines under the lamp's glow, polished, but not worn to dinner, of course. Further down, a court poet, already known for his grace in verse. now measured by his grace in bread breaking. It was never just about rank, it was about harmony, about the delicate balance between power and humility. The king might choose to place a favored advisor far from him, not as punishment, but to shield him from jealous eyes. A disgraced noble, meanwhile, might find himself oddly close, visible but exposed. Every placement held meaning. Every seat was a whisper from the throne. There's an old tale about a banquet hosted during the reign of Darius the Fur. One of the nobles, a distant cousin with more pride than tact, tried to rise and change his seat, closer to the head of the table, closer to power. He only managed 2 steps before a server silently dropped a ladle, drawing every eye. The noble sat back down immediately, red-faced, never to attempt the same again. Historians still argue whether that moment was planned or whether the ladle simply slipped. But in Persian courts, even accidents seemed choreographed. As you drift deeper into the scene, you notice that not everyone is seated at the main table. Around the room, in soft semicircles, are smaller gatherings. Daughters of noble families, diplomats from distant lands, learned men from Babylon and beyond, all watching, all included, yet slightly removed. This wasn't exclusion, it was staging. Each table within the hall was arranged like a verse in a poem, each line with its own rhythm, connected by intention. The center of the hall was never the only story. It was simply the loudest silence. You let your attention wander to a distant corner, where a young servant stands beside an empty seat. Not a high one, not low either, polished, yet unoccupied. It waits quietly, its cushion fluffed just so. No one acknowledges it, yet no one takes it. You wonder, dreamily, if it's reserved for someone late, or someone lost, or someone whose presence, though absent, still casts a place of pause in the night. In some courts, it's said, they left one seat untouched in honor of Ahura Mazda, the divine flame, the guiding wisdom, a reminder that above all human arrangement, there was something larger still watching. The idea soothes you. In ancient Persia, no moment stood on its own. Everything existed in relation to something else. To eat beside someone was to share their destiny, even if only for a night. You look again at the king. He doesn't speak. He doesn't need to. His presence shapes the room like gravity shapes orbits. Around him, words are unnecessary. There is grace in knowing your place, and no shame in being placed there. In this world, honor lies not just in closeness to power, but in how you hold yourself within it. You begin to imagine what it might feel like to be placed deliberately, neither too close nor too far, just visible enough to matter, just distant enough to breathe. And you wonder, softly, idly, how it would feel if modern life still carried this kind of choreography. If dinner parties still whispered in seating arrangements, if choosing a chair meant choosing a story. But then, perhaps it still does. In families, in friendships, in long dinner tables where someone always seems to sit at the end, unspoken but known. The more you think about it, the more the past doesn't feel so far away. A nearby guest lifts their hand, not to speak, but to motion gently for bread. The server nods without words and begins moving in slow, practiced steps. As they pass between cushions and trays, you notice how their path curves like a river, never crossing certain guests, always bending around others. Even their walking route seems dictated by invisible lines drawn in silence. Everything flows. Everything knows where it's meant to go. You find yourself letting go a little more. The hush of the hall is no longer mysterious. It's comforting, like a lullaby sung in gestures, in glances, in where one sits and who they sit beside. The bread arrives, and again, no words are spoken, just a nod, a hand extended, a piece gently offered. It's a quiet kind of communion, this meal, And somehow, the rules don't feel restrictive. They feel like rhythm, like lullabies for the body. You can almost hear it, the heartbeat of the feast, slow and steady. One pulse for each rule observed. One beat for every seat assigned with care. Even now, centuries later, you can still feel the order of it, the calm within the structure, the kindness that comes from knowing where you belong, if only for the length of a single candlelit meal. You close your eyes, just briefly, and the room softens. The guests blur slightly, the lamps flicker more slowly. Everything feels just a little farther away, and a little closer too. The king remains still, the bread is passed, and the silence, warm as saffron, holds everything gently in place. But you notice, as the bread is passed and lifted with reverent fingers, that no one reaches for it too quickly. No one tears into it with hunger or haste. The motions are small, respectful, almost meditative. Every guest seems to know the exact moment to extend a hand, the precise fold of bread needed to scoop a bit of stew, the perfect angle to avoid any stray drip. There are no forks, none, not on the royal table, not in the servant's corner, not hidden in some drawer awaiting dessert. And it's not because they haven't been invented. A few cultures had begun experimenting with sharp prongs for sweet fruits or delicate meat. But here, in the heart of ancient Persia, forks are not part of the ritual. They are unnecessary intrusions. Knives are kept far from the table, left in the kitchens or strapped to the belts of soldiers. The table is a place of peace, of ritual, and of quiet trust. Spoons, though, spoons are sacred, wide-bowled, ornately carved, and often passed from one guest to another with silent care. You see one now, resting on a small dish of quince and lamb stew. It gleams faintly in the golden light, its curve smooth from years of use. But no one grabs it. It's placed gently, deliberately. A spoon never travels alone. It is always accompanied by intention. And then, of course, there's the bread, flat, warm, flexible, slightly charred at the edges. In this world, bread is more than bread. It is a utensil, a tool, a companion to every dish. You watch as a guest, a woman with henned hands and soft eyes, tears off a triangle of bread, folds it into a loose scoop, and lifts a bite of stew. Not a drop spills, not a crumb falls. It is graceful and slow, like a gesture from a dream you only half remember. But even here, in this simplicity, there are rules. You may only use your right hand. The left is considered unclean, not shamed, not cursed, just reserved for different tasks. To eat with the left hand is to disrupt the balance, and balance is everything. Children are taught from an early age to fold bread without creases. A crumpled scoop is a sign of haste, sloppiness. Some elders even believed it could invite misfortune. A crooked fold, a crooked day. You blink slowly, imagining the small childhood lessons passed down in kitchens and courtyards. The way a mother might smile as she presses a warm round of bread into tiny fingers, whispering, "Just the edge, just like this. Let the bread do the holding." And still, you might wonder, why no fingers? Why so much ceremony over something so basic? Because for the Persians, the act of eating was not private. It was shared, witnessed. And to share a meal without grace was to offer discomfort instead of communion. Using fingers, raw and quick and clumsy, broke the spell. It made something sacred into something mundane. But there were exceptions. In homes less gilded than this imagined feast, fingers did find their way into dishes, warm family meals at low tables in small rooms, fathers dipping into yogurt, children sneaking dates from the tray before being scolded with a laugh. And sometimes, just sometimes, Even in the royal court, a beloved guest might break decorum, tear a piece of bread with both hands, and scoop a second helping before the host could offer it. Gasps might follow, a hush might fall, but if the guest was truly cherished, the king might only smile, eyes twinkling. There's a story passed down from the time of Xerxes, told in quiet tones by kitchen workers and musicians. It's said that during a particularly long banquet, the king's favorite jester reached for a bowl of stew with both hands, elbows out, posture atrocious, and slurped loudly. Everyone froze, but Xerxes only laughed, handed him more bread, and declared, "At least someone here eats like he's hungry." Historians still argue whether it ever happened, but the tale lives on, told at family gatherings and whispered between cooks late at night. Because sometimes, breaking the rules, just gently, is its own kind of ritual. You stretch slightly, imagining the way your own fingers would feel, cupping warm bread, letting the steam rise gently to your face. It's not a hungry thought. It's a quiet one, a soft warmth that sits in your chest like candlelight. The spoon is passed again. The stew is lifted. Bread is folded. Nothing rushed, nothing loud. The feast continues, not as a march, but as a slow dance, each motion flowing into the next. It's easy to forget that no one has spoken, and yet you feel as though conversations are happening everywhere, in the tilt of a head, the offering of a dish, the way one guest waits for another to finish before moving their hand. This is not just dining, this is choreography, and like all good performances, it relies on unspoken trust. You wonder, dreamily, if this is what eating used to feel like, before schedules and screens, before multitasking and standing meals, before forks became our fingers. You imagine sharing a table where silence feels like a gift, where food slows you down instead of speeding you up, where bread folds itself into a memory. Outside, the stars continue to appear, quiet and unbothered. The night is deepening, but the room remains still, anchored by firelight and the steady pace of hands and spoons. The king watches, still not eating. His face is calm, unreadable. Perhaps he's waiting for one more guest to begin. Or perhaps he simply enjoys watching the harmony unfold. The meal moves forward like a tide, gentle and precise. Spoons are lifted, bread is folded, no forks, no knives, just hands, heat, and ritual. And somewhere, between one bite and the next, you realize that in ancient Persia, the absence of cutlery wasn't a lack. It was a choice to feel the food, to share it with more than just the mouth, to let the fingers remember. You breathe in. The scent of saffron lingers. The rhythm continues. And the feast goes on. The bread is folded, the spoon placed down with care. And now, just as the second course is beginning to settle in, the softest movement glides through the room like a breeze through hanging curtains. A figure approaches, robed in pale linen, his feet bare against the cool stone. He holds a tall pitcher carved from polished metal, its shape long and lean, like the curve of a swan's neck. His presence is unspoken, his task singular, to offer water. But this is no ordinary service. No splashing, no clinking cups, no voice calling out. Would you like some? In the royal halls of ancient Persia, the act of serving water was more like choreography, quiet, flowing, and exact. He does not walk straight. He glides. His steps seem to follow a path drawn by memory or music, pausing just behind each guest, waiting for the subtlest of gestures, a lowered gaze, a hand resting palm up beside a dish, a stillness that signals readiness. These are his cues, and he never needs more. You watch him now, this water bearer, as he reaches the elder seated near the head of the table. Without eye contact, without a word, He tilts the pitcher and fills the shallow bowl before the guest. The water pours in a perfect ribbon. No bubbles, no splash. Just the faintest ripple on the surface. Then stillness again. The elder lifts the bowl, sips once, and places it back with such gentle precision that the sound is barely a whisper. The water bearer moves on. His role may seem small, even invisible, but in this place, he is essential. Because water was more than refreshment, it was a signal, a cleanser, a moment of pause, and his performance was one of perfect restraint. To speak while pouring, unthinkable. To pour before being invited, an insult. To skip someone by mistake, a disaster. There's a story whispered in kitchens and among old scrolls of a young servant who, eager to impress, poured water before the king's signal. No rebuke was given, but he was never seen at a banquet again. Whether he was reassigned or dismissed entirely remains unknown. Historians still argue whether that silence was mercy or punishment. In Persian culture, water itself held layers of meaning. It wasn't simply a drink, it was life, purity, blessing. Some believed that to offer water without intention was to offer emptiness. And so, the water bearer was not a waiter. He was a keeper of rhythm, a guardian of flow. Even the vessels mattered. In wealthier homes, water might be served from rose-gilded jugs, cooled with slices of cucumber or scented with mint. But in the royal court, the design was deliberate, silver or bronze, tall and narrow, to preserve chill and prevent waste. The bowls, too, were wide and shallow, never too deep. Guests were expected to sip slowly, with grace, never gulping or draining in one go. You let your mind drift toward the texture of the bowl, smooth, cool, light in the hand. The water, freshly drawn from a stone well hours before, filtered through linen, set out to settle, chilled beneath clay. The bearer's movements trace a pattern across the room, and you begin to see them not as random paths, but as lines in a poem. Each pour, a soft verse. Each step, a pause. He moves beside a pair of young guests now, perhaps cousins, perhaps diplomats from a far province. One glances up, barely. The water flows. The other waits, unsure. A slight nod from the bearer invites him, and he accepts with a smile that's more thankful than thirsty. There's something soothing about this rhythm. It asks nothing from you. It demands no reply. It simply offers, and lets you respond when you're ready. In some households, the water was infused with herbs meant to calm the body or sharpen the mind. Infusions of saffron, lime blossom, or basil. Not all at once, of course. Each one chosen with care, matched to the mood of the meal or the needs of the guests. Tonight, you imagine the water is lightly touched with rose, just enough to carry a memory of gardens under moonlight. You breathe it in through the story, through the quiet that carries the scent to your mind. No one toasts, no one raises glasses high and calls out names. That's not how it's done here. Even gratitude is subtle. A lifted bowl, a brief moment of eye contact with the server, nothing more, because to over-celebrate water would be to miss its point. Its gift is in the stillness it brings, the soft interlude between flavors, the gentle invitation to pause. You rest now. You're breathing slow. The room is dimmer than before. The lamps have burned down slightly, their flames smaller, more focused. They cast long shadows that stretch across the floor like threads in a tapestry. The water bearer is nearing the end of his journey. As he passes behind the king, he does not stop. Not because the king is excluded, but because the king, too, waits for silence. For the moment when others have been seen, only then will the final bowl be filled. It's a small act, but one that carries the weight of an empire. And so, the bearer turns, returning to his place near the wall. Pitcher now empty. his work complete, his path traced like a slow comet across the stars of this quiet, celestial feast. You watch him disappear into the shadows, and you feel a kind of peace settle in his wake. The room, once waiting, now glows with a deeper calm. There is something strangely moving about someone whose entire role is to wait, to watch, to serve without being seen, and to do so with such care that the act becomes a form of beauty. You wonder how many such people moved through history, not with swords or crowns, but with quiet grace. And you wonder if, perhaps, the ones who made the silence were just as important as the ones who filled it. The meal continues, slowly. You lean into the softness of it, into the hush that follows each pour, each sip, and in that hush, you rest. The hush, so carefully kept throughout the pouring of water, holds just a little longer. You can almost hear it, this stillness, not empty but full, like a breath being held. Everyone has their dish, everyone has their bread, everyone has water now, cooling quietly in shallow bowls beside them, and yet, no one eats, not truly, not yet, because here, in the candlelit hush of a Persian feast, no one dares take the first bite until the correct person begins. And that person, it changes, depending on time, place, and subtle lines of invisible power. You shift gently on your cushion, sensing the unspoken rule pressing softly around the room like silk against skin. The food has been served, the water has been poured, the scent of cinnamon and coriander lingers like a lullaby in the air. Still, hands remain in laps, bread untouched, spoons resting, eyes quietly alert. In some circles, it is the king who begins the meal, not by lifting a spoon, but by making a gesture, a slight incline of the head, the lift of a single hand, the slow movement of bread toward a dish, a signal that it's time, that harmony has been reached, that hunger may now give way to satisfaction. But not always. Sometimes it is the oldest guest who starts, a scholar, a sage, a relative who holds more years than rank. In those cases, the king himself may wait, not as a show of humility, but of balance. Let the one who has lived longest taste first. Let their wisdom test the food for more than flavor. You imagine a long-bearded man at one end of the table, eyes half closed, folding his bread with trembling fingers. All eyes on him, though no one stares. The room leans in, not forward, but inward, toward the moment. He lifts the bite, he chews, slowly, thoughtfully, and then, just when the silence threatens to hold too tightly, he smiles, a small smile, just enough, and the meal begins. There's an old tale told among Persian cooks about a banquet where no one knew who should eat first. The king was young, the elder was late, and the guests sat frozen. A full 15 minutes passed, food cooling on golden platters, before the court jester, tired of waiting, took a loud, theatrical bite of a grape. He did it with such flourish and fake delight that the entire table erupted in laughter. The tension broke, the king waved his hand, and dinner finally began. Historians still argue whether the story is true, but the lesson remains. In a land where silence meant respect, laughter could mean release. You settle deeper into your seat, tracing the quiet thread of etiquette as it winds through this invisible ceremony. Every rule feels less like control and more like a shared lullaby, something familiar, something meant to hold people close without touching them. The first bite isn't just about food, it's about trust. In a world where poisoning was a real danger, watching someone else eat first wasn't just tradition, it was survival. A noble might watch the elder, a servant might watch the noble. Everyone watched someone, not with suspicion, but with the kind of cautious faith that turns survival into ceremony. Sometimes, the food itself gave clues. At the king's table, a small piece of meat, no larger than a thumbnail, would be placed on a thin sliver of bread and passed to the royal taster, not every night, not every meal, but often enough to remind everyone that nothing was to be taken for granted. You imagine that taster now, seated nearby but not among the guests, dressed plainly, focused entirely. He chews, he swallows, he waits, and everyone else watches the minutes pass, 5, 10, sometimes more, before they lift their spoons. It's strange, in a way. That in a room so filled with richness, the finest spices, the rarest fruits, the most fragrant meats, what mattered most was patience. Even now, you feel its rhythm in your breath, a soft discipline, a gentle waiting, a respect for what is shared, and of course, like all rituals, there were exceptions. There are dusty scrolls, half faded now, that tell of certain feasts where these rules were turned upside down, feasts of celebration, rebellion, or mourning. In such moments, the king might invite the youngest child to take the first bite, symbolizing new beginnings, or the servant who baked the bread, or the prisoner offered forgiveness. These gestures were rare, but when they happened, they rippled like quiet waves through the court, reminders that rules could bend, that moments could soften, that grace didn't always come from power. You exhale slowly, imagining what it would feel like to be that child, that baker, that surprise guest offered the first taste. Not just of food, but of honor. In those moments, food became more than sustenance. It became story. The bread breaks, the spoon lifts, the bite is taken, and once it begins, it flows. All across the table, hands move in soft synchronization. Bread folded, stew gathered, water sipped. But even now, with the meal in full swing, there's no rush, no clamor, no piling of plates. The pace remains steady, respectful, rhythmic. The first bite is not a race to the next. It is an opening note in a melody that stretches across the evening. A melody made not of sound, but of gesture, of steam, of shared warmth. You blink slowly. The lamps flicker. The shadows stretch and sway. You feel the hush softening even more now. Not because the rules are strict, but because they are followed with love. Each person knows their role. Each hand waits its turn. And in the silence between bites, the story of a people, precise, poetic, patient, unfolds like steam from a fragrant bowl. Tonight, you are part of it, not watching, but sensing, not eating, but understanding. And in the gentle rhythm of that first bite, everything begins. Once the first bite has been taken, once the invisible curtain has lifted and the feast flows freely, the bread begins to move, not wildly, not clumsily, but with the quiet dignity of something sacred. You notice now how much attention it draws. Though no one says a word about it, no toasts are raised to bread, no one claps when it's served, and yet it is always there, present, warm, silent. In ancient Persia, bread was never just a side dish. It was the foundation, the constant, the one thing that appeared at every meal, from the royal court to the humblest household, a flat, round expression of care and order. You watch as a new round is brought to the table. It's thinner than you expect, almost translucent in places, with slightly charred edges and a center still soft from the heat. It smells faintly of wheat and smoke, and something richer underneath. Maybe oil, maybe memory. The server lays it down without sound, folding one corner under itself like a bow. No one reaches for it right away. It must cool slightly. It must rest. And then, only then, a hand moves. A guest tears a piece off the round, but not with force, never with force, always with the fingers, never the palm, always pulled toward the chest, never away from the table. A subtle but essential difference. You imagine being taught this as a child, sitting beside your father, perhaps, or your grandmother, learning not just how to tear, but how to honor the bread, not to squeeze it, not to drop it, and never, never to leave it upside down. There's a story often told in whispers across Persian kitchens about a merchant's son who flipped a piece of bread carelessly while reaching for honey. The room fell quiet. His uncle, without raising his voice, simply turned the bread right side up and placed his hand over it. "Respect the giver," he said, "even when the gift is small." Historians still argue whether this was a common superstition or a cultural value, but in either case, the meaning remains. Bread is never torn thoughtlessly. Even the act of sharing it follows rules. You don't offer someone a half-torn piece. That would be insulting. Instead, you tear a clean portion, fold it once, and pass it gently, fingertips to fingertips, without tossing or dropping. It is not a loaf, it is not a roll, it is something between breath and ritual. You notice now how the bread is used with skill. A guest dips it, folds it, lifts stew in perfect silence. There's no spoon for the thicker sauces, only this bread, curved and sure, like a second hand. No drips fall, no fingers touch the food. The bread does everything, and it listens. That's how it feels, at least. As if the bread is paying attention, waiting to be asked, never intruding, always folding, always serving. Some rounds are sprinkled with sesame seeds, others with dried herbs. The ones tonight are plain, perhaps because the stew is already rich, already full of conversation. The bread, in this case, is here to balance, to offer contrast, a moment of calm between bites. You watch as a guest offers a piece to someone across the table. He doesn't speak, he just holds it out, palm up, piece folded, eyes soft. The other man accepts it with both hands. Not required, perhaps, but respectful. They nod to one another, nothing more. And you realize, as you breathe in the warmth of that small gesture, that this bread carries meaning far beyond hunger. In many homes, bread was kissed before being thrown away. If it had to be, not for superstition, but out of gratitude, because the work that went into making it, the planting, the harvesting, the grinding, the baking, deserved acknowledgement, even in parting. It was said that a careless attitude toward bread invited a careless attitude toward life, that if you rush the breaking, you might rush the listening. And so families slowed down, even if only for that one moment. At royal feasts, there was a special person, sometimes a servant, sometimes a trusted advisor, whose job was to taste the bread before it was served, not for poison, for texture, for warmth, to ensure it was soft enough, strong enough, and worthy of the guests. You imagine him now, fingertips pressing into a warm round just moments before it left the kitchen, not cutting it, just feeling, listening. In that moment, the bread wasn't judged like food. It was welcomed like a friend. The bread is passed again now. The round grows smaller, but it doesn't disappear. Not yet. It lingers, offering its last pieces like final verses in a poem. You wonder if anyone will take the last bite, or if it will be left, deliberately, as a quiet sign of restraint. In many traditions, the last piece of bread is never eaten, not because it is sacred, but because it is offered to those not present, to the memory of guests who once sat at the table, to the hope of future company, to the idea that something should always remain unclaimed. The room around you grows warmer, the lamps flicker low, the stews are thickening, cooling in their bowls, and yet the bread remains soft, as if it remembers the oven, as if it refuses to forget where it came from. You take another breath, slow, gentle. The scent of the bread still drifts through the air, mixing with rose, with cumin, with stories older than memory. You begin to understand why bread, in this world, was more than food. It was practice. It was posture. It was a lesson that began in the kitchen and continued at the table, a quiet, golden thread weaving together everything else. The spoons might come and go. The water may be poured and drained, but the bread remains. And in the way it's held, enfolded and broken, just so, you begin to feel something loosen in your chest, a kind of calm, a kind of care, a kind of sleepiness. The bread lingers like a closing note, its scent still warm in the air, its edges softening beside cooling bowls. And then, almost as if summoned by the hush, the stews arrive again, not new, but deepened, their colors richer now, their aromas more concentrated. You feel the air shift, not with movement, but with flavor, with time. The scent rises first, a slow ribbon of pomegranate and walnut, a murmur of turmeric, a deep echo of meat that has been simmering for hours, perhaps longer. The stew doesn't shout, it exhales, thick and gentle, as though it knows exactly where it's going. The servers return in silence. Bowls are exchanged, old ones lifted away like dreams fading into morning. New ones placed with both hands, centered perfectly on the low table. No words, just steam and ceremony. This is fesenjan. You realize the pride of Persian cuisine. A stew so dark it's nearly purple, thickened with ground walnuts and sharpened with the tart sweetness of pomegranate molasses. You imagine the taste before it touches the tongue, velvet, sour, sweet, dense with memory, a dish that holds the weight of generations. But before the first spoonful is lifted, the rules return, no one digs in. There is an order, a pace. You wait, you breathe, and then someone moves, not the king, not the eldest guest. A woman this time, seated near the center, a poet's daughter, perhaps. She picks up her spoon, carved from dark wood and polished smooth. It catches no light. It has no ornament, but it fits in her hand like it belongs there. She lowers it, not into the stew, but into a small dish of yogurt resting beside it, cooling, plain, thick enough to hold its shape. A single swirl of the spoon, a gentle fold into the stew. Only then does she take a bite. You see others follow, no rush, just a ripple of spoons, small movements, practiced and slow. In ancient Persia, stews were rarely served alone. There were companions, yogurt, pickled herbs, sweet fruit pastes, garlic and vinegar. Each side dish offered balance, and each one had its own rules. You never mixed them without purpose. You never layered more than two. The idea wasn't indulgence. It was harmony. There's a story passed down about a nobleman who, overwhelmed by the abundance of his table, added yogurt, fruit, and garlic all at once to his stew. The flavors clashed. He made a face, and an elder beside him murmured gently, "Even kindness spoils when poured too thick." Historians still debate the origin of that line, but cooks remember it, because in Persian meals, restraint was a form of love. To taste every element, to pause between bites, to allow the stew to speak before layering your own desires upon it. You picture a kitchen far from the palace, clay walls, stone floors, a copper pot bubbling over a low flame. The cook there tastes with the back of a wooden spoon, eyes half closed. Not measuring heat or salt, but balance, always asking, what does this want to become? And now, here at the table, the answer arrives. The guests begin to eat, not in silence exactly, but in a kind of softened presence. Some close their eyes, some pause after each bite. A few hum quietly, not from hunger, but from the comfort of remembering. Because stew in Persia was not just a dish, it was a story, one that changed with each region, each season, each pair of hands. There's gourmet sabzi too, a green stew, deep and earthy, made from herbs that sing of soil and time, fenugreek, parsley, leeks, dried limes. The smell is sharper, wilder, less regal, more rooted. You imagine this one coming from the mountains, where sheep graze under wind-whipped skies, and women stir pots while telling stories of the stars. A guest dips their spoon, then another. You can feel the hush thickening, not from silence, but from togetherness, the kind that doesn't need sound. Even the spoons have their own choreography. You hold them with 3 fingers, never the whole hand, you never clink against the bowl, and you never lick the spoon. That would be like shouting in a library. Each guest receives the same portion. Each bowl holds the same weight, but the pace varies. Some eat slowly, contemplatively. Others take shorter breaks between bites, their eyes lowered in concentration. No one rushes. The stew sets the rhythm, not the appetite. At the edge of the room, a young server watches, not to hurry the guests, not to clear the dishes, but to observe, to notice when a bowl grows cool, or a guest finishes without signaling, to make sure no one, not even the quietest among them, goes overlooked, and you, nestled now in your imagined place, begin to feel the magic of it, of being seen without being watched, of being fed without being asked, of eating without hurry. The stews, you realize, are less about fullness and more about presence. Each bite holds something old, something passed down, something that was stirred not just by a hand, but by a heart. You breathe deeply. The spices linger in your nose, not sharp, but warming. They curl around the back of your throat like a lullaby made of heat. And in that moment, you understand. This isn't just food, it's memory, cooked down to its softest form. Some say that a good Faisanjan should be thick enough to coat the back of a spoon, but thin enough to flow like silk. Some say gourmet sabzi should smell like the wind through a garden after rain. But all agree, if the stew makes you close your eyes, even for a second, it has done its job. So, you close your eyes now. Not from sleep, not yet, but from stillness. From the comfort of knowing that somewhere, long ago, someone else closed their eyes over this same flavor, this same hush. And in the silence of the spoon, the story continues. The air around you feels warmer now, softened by stew, thickened by bread, and gently perfumed with the quiet satisfaction that follows a well-timed bite. The clinking of spoons is still absent, not because metal is forbidden, but because no one would think to let a utensil interrupt the hush. A meal like this doesn't need volume. It needs rhythm, thoughtfulness. You look around. There are mouths moving, but they're not speaking. They're tasting, chewing slowly, swallowing quietly. One guest closes her eyes between bites. Another places his spoon down after each mouthful, as if letting the stew rest just as much as himself. And though the lamps flicker softly and shadows stretch longer across the floor, not a single voice rises above a whisper, if any are heard at all. Because in ancient Persia, one rule sat quietly above many others. You never spoke with food in your mouth, not even softly, not even by accident. It wasn't a matter of manners, it was a matter of meaning. Speaking while chewing wasn't just considered rude. It was considered a disruption to the ritual of eating itself. And when meals were as ceremonial as this, any disruption rippled wider than it seemed. The idea was simple. To eat was to listen, to the food, to your own body, to the silence of the table, and to speak while eating meant you weren't listening. You were inserting yourself, uninvited. There's a story told of an ambitious young courtier who, midway through a lavish feast, made a clever comment about the king's hunting dogs. while chewing on a mouthful of lentils. He meant it as a compliment, but the king, instead of laughing, simply paused, laid down his spoon, and looked at him. Nothing was said. The courtier swallowed, but he did not speak again for the rest of the night. Historians still argue whether the king took offense or simply wanted silence. But the story stayed, passed down like a warning wrapped in a whisper. At the royal table, silence wasn't emptiness, it was grace. You shift slightly, sinking deeper into your imagined cushion. There's a rhythm to the quiet now, not awkward, not stiff. It flows, soft and even, like the pattern of shadows across a tapestry. You realize that guests do communicate, just not with voices. One lifts a spoon halfway, then pauses, glancing at another across the table. A smile, a nod, the spoon continues. Another finishes his bowl and folds his hands. A server approaches, not with a word, but with a new dish. The rhythm continues. You wonder how much of your own life might shift if you let meals be like this. Slower, quieter, fuller, not in size, but in presence. Even in more modest Persian homes, this rule held firm. Children were taught early. Eat first, speak later. Not to stifle expression, but to honor the act of nourishment, to give it space, respect. And in the moments between bites, when mouths were empty and eyes lifted, conversations could begin, softly, sparingly. You imagine what those murmurs might sound like. A question about the stew, a compliment to the baker, a gentle memory shared across generations. Never loud, never rushed, never with a full mouth. This wasn't restraint for the sake of appearances. It was a kind of reverence, as if the food deserved to be tasted fully, not talked over, as if chewing itself was sacred. You notice how each guest gives themselves time. Between spoonfuls, there is pause. Between sips of water, there is stillness. And in that stillness, reflection blooms. Not every meal was as formal as this. Of course, there were festivals, weddings, rowdier affairs. But even then, the old ones would gently remind, let the food settle before you speak. Let your body finish before your thoughts begin. Some say the rule began with Zoroastrian customs, where purity of action, word, and thought were closely intertwined. To speak with a full mouth was to mix things that should remain separate. It muddied the order. And in Persia, order was not control, it was harmony. You breathe slowly, letting that idea settle into your chest. The harmony of small things. One bite, one breath, one quiet. The servers continue their work without ever asking. More? They already know. They read the placement of spoons, the angle of empty bowls, the gentle rise of a guest's hand, not to speak, but to gesture. Every movement at this table says something, but none of it is noise. The silence begins to feel almost melodic. It isn't total. There's the sound of stew being stirred, of cloth brushing against cushions, of breath moving through nostrils, soft and slow. These aren't interruptions. They're music. And within that music, each guest seems to find their own rhythm. Some eat with long pauses. Some linger over yogurt or preserved lemons. No one rushes. There is no finish line here, only presence. There's an old proverb, half faded in parchment, that reads, "The tongue waits until the stomach bows." You picture a child being taught those words, tracing the letters with their finger, a parent nodding, not strict, just patient. And you begin to wonder, if only quietly, how often words in your own world arrive too early, before the taste is finished, before the meaning has had time to settle. Here, at this ancient table, the mouth knows its seasons, one for chewing, one for sipping, one for speaking, never all at once, each part honored in turn. A guest across the table sets down her spoon. Her hands rest in her lap. She glances to her right, a short breath. Then, softly, the first full sentence you've heard in what feels like hours. The quince this year is better than last. It is not profound. It is not loud, but it is perfect. Others nod, some smiling. No one interrupts. No one leaps to add. The comment floats there, resting gently in the space it was given. Then, like all things in this room, it settles. It becomes part of the hush, folded back into the stillness. You exhale, slowly. The silence is not heavy. It is soft. It holds you like a blanket, not to mute you, but to let you breathe. And as you settle back into the warmth of the moment, spoon resting, stomach full, you feel a kind of gratitude rise, not just for the food, but for the quiet that let you taste it fully. You smile, though no one sees, and the hush continues. You sit still, wrapped in silence, warmed by spices and slowness. Around you, the table breathes, not in motion, but in presence. Spoons move and settle. Bread is passed and received. The stews, now half-eaten, rest like quiet pools under flickering lamplight. The rhythm of the meal is steady now, deep like a river's middle stretch. And somewhere along that river, one guest has not yet eaten. The king. He sits at the head of the table, framed by soft shadows and golden light. His face is composed, neither stern nor smiling. His hands rest on his lap, still. A bowl sits before him, perfectly arranged, gently steaming, but untouched, because in ancient Persia, the king's food was not truly his own. At least, not right away. You begin to notice the space around him. It's not just the seat that matters. It's the stillness that surrounds it. A clear buffer. No elbows lean too close. No conversations cross in front of him. The silence near the king is not one of fear, but of sacredness, a kind of reverence, as though the space itself holds history. The king does not reach for his spoon. He waits. And you, now deep in the ceremony, begin to understand why. Before the king eats, someone else must eat first, on his behalf. The food taster, a role as old as monarchy itself, and never fully trusted, because even in this room of beauty, of gentle gestures and golden platters, danger can still drift in on the tip of a spoon. You watch now as a man steps forward, plainly dressed, silent, methodical. He bows slightly. No words pass between him and the king. None are needed. He lifts the bowl, not the entire portion, just a small sample, and turns away, taking it to a low stool near the wall. There, beneath a dim lamp, he eats, slowly, observed only by the time. It's not dramatic. There are no guards, no sniffing dogs or poison daggers, just a man, chewing thoughtfully, waiting for what does not come. The poison, if it were there, would show itself quickly. This isn't theater, this is life, and yet, despite its weight, the moment passes softly. The taster wipes his mouth with the back of his hand. He nods once to no one in particular, and disappears. Only then does the king raise his spoon. It's a quiet moment, but a powerful one. The moment where permission is granted not through decree, but through example. Now the stews are lifted again. Bread is torn with renewed care. Conversation, still soft, still minimal, flickers like candlelight between seated guests. And still, the king does not dominate. In fact, he eats less than most. One bite, two, then a long pause. He speaks to no one. He gestures only when necessary. His power, you realize, comes not from eating first, but from eating last, and eating less. There's a legend about Cyrus the Great, how, during one storm-lashed campaign, He insisted on eating only after every soldier had received food. His meal, that night, was a crust of bread and a handful of cold lentils. He said they tasted better than any royal feast. Historians still argue if the story is fact or fable, but it was retold for centuries, not to glorify hunger, but to remind. A ruler is not served by food alone. He is served by patience, by presence, by humility. You look again at the king's bowl. It is no more ornate than the others. The same shape, the same size, the same spoon, carved from wood, held lightly between fingers that wear no rings tonight. There are no elaborate garnishes, no secret spices, no extra portion of lamb, because here, at this table, the king's food must reflect the nation. He eats what they eat, or he does not eat at all. This wasn't always the case in other kingdoms, but in Persia, especially during the Achaemenid period, the king was expected to model restraint, elegance, dignity, not indulgence. He could feast, yes, he could command towers of dates and fountains of wine, but he rarely did, because to lose the table's discipline was to risk losing the kingdom's. You imagine how difficult that must be, to hold such power, and yet be watched for how you chew, to be remembered not for your voice, but for the way you use silence. Some say Persian kings were chosen not just for their lineage, but for their temperament at the table, how they handled a spoon, how they shared a dish, what they reached for, and what they left untouched. The idea wasn't control, it was example. A good king taught with every bite. A guest now offers him something, a folded piece of bread, the crust dusted with herbs. The king accepts it, not with grandeur, but with quiet gratitude. He nods, and for a moment, smiles. The entire room seems to exhale. There's no applause, no clinking of cups, just the return to rhythm, stew, spoon, pause, and beneath it all, the unspoken understanding. The table is not a stage, it is a mirror. What is placed before the king is not just food, it is a reflection of peace or unrest, of gratitude or fear, of discipline or decay. And tonight, it seems, the reflection is steady. You find your own breath matching the pace of the meal again. In, out, no hurry, no sharpness. The kind of breath you take when you're not thinking about breathing, only feeling it. The king takes one final spoonful. Then he places the utensil down. A server moves in, almost instantly, not to remove the bowl, but to bow. The meal is nearing its close, not ended, just beginning to fade. You wonder, in your own quiet way, what it might feel like to be so deeply watched, to know that your smallest gestures shape the evening, to understand that your silence teaches more than your speech. And then you realize, perhaps we all hold a bit of that power, at any table, at any meal, to choose stillness, to offer kindness, to lead by example, even when no one is watching, especially then. The king's final spoonful rests now in memory. The bowl before him is still, emptied with grace, and left untouched since. Around the room, the meal has entered its gentlest phase, not quite ending, not quite continuing, just floating, like the hour between sunset and night, when the sky forgets its color and becomes something else entirely. And in this softness, your gaze rises, above the table, beyond the bowls, toward the light. Because in ancient Persia, dining was not just governed by appetite or status. It was guided by fire and stars. You notice now what you hadn't before, the arrangement of flames in the room. They're not random. The oil lamps aren't scattered wherever was convenient. They form patterns, quiet alignments that mirror the heavens above. 3 along the east wall, 2 more to the west. One central flame, larger, steadier. flickering in a bronze basin that smells faintly of cedar and clove. It is not there for heat. It is not there for beauty. It is there for balance. The Persians believed fire had its own wisdom. In Zoroastrian tradition, fire was sacred, not as a god, but as a symbol of purity, clarity, truth. And so, it makes sense that the dinner table, too, would reflect that reverence. The lamps are tended by quiet hands, no abrupt movements, no smoke. When a wick is trimmed, it's done with such care that the flame barely wavers. And when new oil is added, it is poured in a slow, spiraling motion, a small ritual in itself. You notice how the flames light the table, not all equally. Some faces remain in soft shadow, others brushed with gold. It's not favoritism, it's placement. The guests who speak least are often those most illuminated, as if the fire favors listeners over talkers. And then there's the sky. This feast takes place indoors, yet you sense it would be no different under the open night. Persian banquets, especially in warmer months, were often held in courtyards, beneath stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Food was timed not just by the appetite, but by the sky's color. Guests would arrive just after sundown, while the west still held a faint trace of orange. The first course would be served when the sky turned indigo. The stew, the heart of the meal, would arrive just as the first stars appeared. And dessert? That belonged to the full night. Even now, with walls around you and lamps overhead, the sky finds its way into the meal. The flames mimic stars. The shadows move like drifting constellations. And the pace of everything, the silence, the serving, the small gestures, feels aligned with something bigger than any one person. There's a story often told about Darius the Verse and his favorite astrologer, a man said to dine only when a certain star crossed a certain part of the sky. The king once asked him, jokingly, if the stew would wait for the stars. The astrologer replied, "The stew waits for nothing, but I wait for what watches me back." Historians still debate whether the tale is true, but Persian calendars, celestial and precise, were real. Meals were often aligned with the movement of heavenly bodies. New moons signaled certain dishes. Equinoxes marked the serving of symbolic fruits. Even the first pomegranate of the season had a proper date. You breathe deeply now, and the scent of the room begins to change. Not stronger, just different. The stews are gone, the breads are fewer, and something sweeter rides the air. A perfume of dates, rose water, and perhaps a whisper of cardamom. But still, no dessert appears yet, not until the flames align. The central fire dims slightly, not extinguished, only adjusted, the wick trimmed, the oil topped. You watch the servant do it with such care that the flickering slows, becomes a steady, steady glow. It's the signal, subtle, but understood. A guest near the center of the table exhales softly. Another folds his napkin, not out of necessity, but as ritual, one by one, without words. Spoons are placed down, water is sipped, bread is rested, all eyes turn to the fire. The moment stretches, and then, quietly, almost imperceptibly, one of the flames flickers twice and flares just slightly brighter. A draft, a cue, it doesn't matter. The meaning is clear. The meal, as it was, has ended, not with applause, not with a speech, but with flame. In ancient Persia, the end of a course wasn't marked by clocks or commands. It was marked by the lamp. When the light shifted, when its dance changed rhythm, so did the meal. You reflect on this now, your breath slow, your limbs heavy with warmth. There's something deeply comforting in the idea that light, not time, moves things forward. That instead of checking a watch, one might simply observe a flicker, a glow, a shadow that has grown too long. You wonder what it would feel like to live that way, not governed by deadlines, but by lamps, not rushed by alarms, but guided by stars. And perhaps, in this moment, you do. The final bowls are removed. The table is cleared, slowly, thoughtfully, no scraping, no stacking, just gentle hands lifting dishes that have fulfilled their purpose. Each guest waits, hands resting, the fire holds steady, watching. You watch too. And in that glow, the room feels like a planet, a world of its own, turning not by force, but by gravity. The gravity of stillness, the gravity of stars, the gravity of a flame that knows exactly when to rise and when to fade. As the last flickers of the flames settle into a slow, steady dance, a gentle quiet returns to the table, not the hush of beginning, but the stillness of in-between, the kind of silence that doesn't ask for more, but waits for what might follow. You sit in that stillness, full yet alert, your breath syncing with the slow rhythm of lamplight and breath and thought. Then, without warning, the servers appear again. No noise, no announcement, just the soft swish of linen, the glint of polished metal, and the faint scent of mint rising in their wake. This time, though, they do not carry food, they carry empty plates, not silver, not gold, clay, mostly pale and cool to the eye, with soft imperfections baked into their curves. Each guest receives one placed directly in front of them, bare, undecorated, cold. You watch closely, sensing the change in the room. The warmth of the meal is still in your chest, the sweetness of rose and stew in the air, and yet now, before every guest, sits a dish that holds nothing. You don't know why. No one does. Not yet. Because in ancient Persia, an empty plate was never just an oversight. It was a signal, a message, a test. You look around. No one reacts, not dramatically, not even with confusion. They simply sit. Some lower their eyes. Others keep their gaze forward, resting their hands in their laps, unmoving. No one reaches for the plate. No one dares to touch it. This, too, is part of the ritual. It is said that during certain royal feasts, especially those held after a harvest, or at the close of a difficult campaign, a course would be served that contained nothing, a deliberate emptiness, placed between abundance and sweetness. It was called the waiting plate. No one was expected to eat. There was nothing to eat. And that was the point. The rule was simple. Do nothing. And yet, the challenge was in simplicity. If a guest spoke first, asked why the plate was empty, they revealed their impatience. If someone laughed, they disrespected the tradition. If anyone reached to remove it, they failed the test entirely. The lesson was quiet, but deep. Not every offering is meant to be taken. You begin to feel the weight of your own plate, not heavy in mass, but in meaning. It rests there like a mirror, a soft, circular reminder to pause, to sit with what you do not understand. It's said that this ritual began during the reign of Cambyses II, when a famine had struck the northern provinces. In solidarity, the king ordered that every royal banquet would include one course of nothing, a silent offering to those who had none. No speech was made, no prayers were said aloud, only the placing of the empty plate. And from that point forward, the tradition remained, a gentle moment of reflection, woven into even the grandest feasts. Historians still argue whether Cambyses began the ritual himself, or whether it was a decision made by his advisors. But across centuries, the meaning stayed the same, even in fullness. Remember the hollow, even in joy. Leave space for absence. You feel your shoulders drop just slightly. The room is dimmer now, the oil in the lamps burning lower. The scent of food has faded into memory. And yet, this moment, this stillness, feels just as rich. The plate before you gleams faintly in the firelight. You don't need to touch it. You don't need to speak. You simply let it be what it is. A pause in the story. You imagine the cooks in the palace kitchen, preparing every dish with precision, only to hand over these perfect circles of clay with no content. And yet, perhaps they required the most care, no cracks, no uneven lips. The emptiness had to feel deliberate, chosen. A guest across the table places their hand gently near the plate, not on it, just beside it, and closes their eyes. It isn't dramatic. It isn't sad. It's simply honoring, because an empty plate doesn't always mean something is missing. Sometimes it means there's room for silence, room for memory, room for gratitude to settle. Now that the noise of eating has faded, there's another story, less official, more whispered, about a feast where a visiting dignitary from a faraway land didn't understand the ritual. When the empty plate arrived, he laughed aloud and called for more wine. The host king, smiling but firm, ordered his plate removed and replaced with a simple bowl of water. The guest, realizing his mistake, dipped his fingers in it, placed them over his heart, and said no more that evening. Some say he left with greater wisdom. Others say he never returned. No one knows if the tale is true. But every time an empty plate appears, the room leans into its quiet. The possibility of that lesson remains. You let yourself lean into it now. You don't resist the stillness. You don't try to interpret. You just watch the shadows stretch across the table. You let the nothingness speak, and slowly, so slowly, the servers return once more, lifting each plate with two hands, as if it were fragile, even though it holds nothing. They remove them in silence, one by one, no rush, no break in rhythm, and once they are gone, something inside you feels lighter, as though by not eating, you've been fed. The table is bare now, cleared not just of food, but of noise, of tension, of desire. The king nods once, imperceptibly, and the lamps are trimmed again, not out, but low. The flame shrinks, the light softens. There will be sweetness next, but not yet. This pause must linger, this breath must stretch. Because in this space, between fullness and dessert, between offering and absence, something ancient and quiet has been preserved. And as you sit in it, you feel the strange comfort of an empty plate, a plate that needed nothing to mean something. The empty plates are gone now, carried off as quietly as they came, and the room has shifted again, not in sound, not in motion, but in feeling. A quiet expectancy lingers in the softened air, like a hush before a song begins. Something is coming. You sense it in the flame light, in the slight tilt of each guest's head, in the delicate stillness that isn't still at all. And then, she arrives. From the far end of the hall, a figure glides forward, not with the posture of a servant, not quite, not with the pace of a guest, either. She is something else, something between, draped in silk so light it flutters as she moves. She steps barefoot onto the stone floor, her ankles adorned with gold bells so small they barely make a sound. But they do. A whisper of a chime, just enough to let the room know. The course has changed. Dessert is not announced. It is danced. She carries no tray at first, no dishes, only herself, her presence. Her role is not to entertain, but to deliver. And she does so with grace woven from patience and tradition. Every turn, every pause, every glance is choreographed, not to show off, but to align, to blend the energy of the room into something new, something light. You watch her spin, slowly, once. Her arms rise like steam from warm rose water. Her eyes do not seek attention. They invite it, gently, then drift on. And when she turns again, a second figure follows. Another dancer, carrying a tray. This tray does not hold grand confections. It holds dates, halved, glistening, filled with crushed walnuts, cardamom, and a single thread of saffron. The scent is soft, almost floral, as if the tray carries a garden in miniature. She places it on the center table with a slow, deliberate bow, then backs away without turning. More dancers follow. Not many, just 2 or 3, each bringing something new. A bowl of preserved quince, thin slices of melon, chilled on plates of hammered silver. A tower of delicate rice cookies, shaped like flowers, their edges dusted with rose sugar. The servers do not speak. The dancers do not perform. They move. They offer. They dissolve into the background like flavor fading from the tongue. This is how dessert arrives, not as a finale, but as an exhale. You notice how no guest reaches forward. Not yet. They wait, because the first touch must come only after the final step. When the last tray is set, the final spin completed, and the dancers leave the room the same way they entered, lightly, completely, like a dream returning to where it began. Only then does the king lift his eyes. He does not nod, he does not speak. He simply lifts a single slice of melon and places it on the plate before the eldest guest at the table. And with that, dessert begins. You breathe in the scent of sweetness, not heavy, not cloying, just enough. The cardamom, the rose, the coolness of mint. You watch as guests pick delicacies with fingertips, small pieces, no plates. Desserts are shared communally, passed gently from hand to hand, sometimes offered directly, palm open, nothing between giver and receiver. There's a story that once during the reign of Xerxes, a general tried to take 2 sweets before the person beside him had touched one. The gesture was not scolded, but the tray was removed, and nothing more was served to him that evening. Historians still argue whether the general was punished, or simply reminded, because dessert, in ancient Persia, was not about indulgence. It was about restraint and grace. No forks, no knives, no heaping, only small tastes. 1 date, 1 slice of melon, a single spoonful of rose custard. The sweets themselves are symbols. The date, a gift of the desert. The quince, a fruit of patience, so bitter when raw, so golden once cooked. The rice cookies, reminders of harvest and the care it takes to transform something plain into something delicate. You taste them in your imagination, not quickly, not hungrily, but as if each one carries a memory you've never quite remembered, a flavor from childhood, perhaps, or a garden you never visited but somehow know. Even the order is considered. Dates first, rich and grounding, then fruit, cleansing and light, and finally, something floral, to let the sweetness fade gently. Like the last light on a distant hill, the room has grown even quieter, if such a thing is possible. The air is slow, the guests are still, some eat, others simply watch. A few close their eyes and breathe in the scent as if it were enough. It often is. You look again for the dancers, but they are gone now, absorbed into the edges of the hall like the final note of a lullaby. They will not return. Their offering has been made. Their silence, a gift. And the flame in the center of the room burns lower now, still steady, still golden, but softer. A slow heartbeat, a warm breath. One guest lifts the last piece of fruit and offers it to another. The gesture is quiet. The second guest shakes her head, smiling, not out of refusal, but out of fullness. The kind that comes not from eating too much, but from having had just enough. There's a phrase scribbled in the margins of a scroll kept in a dusty corner of an old Persian archive. It reads, "The sweetest course is not the one that fills, but the one that lingers." You feel it now. The lingering, the sweetness on the air, the hush around the table, the way your own breath has slowed, naturally, without trying. This is dessert, not just food, but feeling. And as the trays are cleared, as the final sweets are offered, and the last dates quietly disappear, the room seems to grow softer still. The feast has not ended, but it has turned inward, towards stillness, towards sleep, towards something gentle and quiet and earned. And in that glow, with rose on the air and silence in your bones, you rest. The final sweets have been offered, and still, no one rises. The feast, though complete in flavor, remains unfinished in form. There is a quiet yet to unfold, the kind that does not signal an end, but an echo, a continuation of care. You sit in that echo now, hands resting loosely, the warmth of saffron and rose still brushing the inside of your breath. And across the table, you begin to notice something that at first seems small. Nothing is being thrown away. No scraps are swept, no crumbs discarded. The half-sliced melon is covered gently with a linen cloth. The leftover dates are placed carefully back onto their tray, not dumped, not tucked aside, but honored with the same reverence they were served. Because in ancient Persia, leftovers were never waste. They were sacred. You watch as the servers re-enter, this time not to clear the table entirely, but to gather what remains. Their hands move slowly, with intention. Each portion, however small, is collected with quiet purpose. One lifts the uneaten rice cookies, stacking them not in a pile, but in a gentle fan, so they won't crumble. Another pours the last bit of pomegranate stew into a clean bowl, its surface still catching light. These remnants are not rejected, they are preserved. In the Persian tradition, what was not finished belonged not to the trash, but to the wider circle, to the servants, the guards, the cooks, and sometimes the poor. The idea was not charity, it was dignity, because food, once shared, became part of a larger story, and to discard it was to interrupt the story mid-sentence. There's a proverb from an old Persian village that says, "To throw away what the fire has softened is to insult the flame." You imagine the kitchens now, glowing faintly in the near distance, still warm from the meal's labor. Soon, the servers will return with these offerings. Not cast-offs, but continuations, spooned into smaller bowls, shared among quiet hands, eaten slowly under the same stars that once watched over the king's table. In this world, to be fed after the feast is not an afterthought. It is an inclusion. Even in households without grand halls or dancers, this rule held fast. Bread that remained was wrapped in cloth and set aside with care. Fruit was divided again the next morning. A stew was thinned, reheated, and offered to neighbors as something new. You think now of the hand that folded that cloth, the quiet smile of someone wrapping a date to carry to a friend too old to leave her home. The rhythm of giving wasn't always loud. It often arrived in packages no larger than a fist, filled with sweetness and care. And at royal banquets, this tradition became ritual. The king, when rising from the table, was expected to leave behind at least one portion untouched, not as waste, but as offering, not to gods, but to people, to those who watched the meal from behind pillars, who poured the wine, who cleared the dishes, who lit the flames. A king who finished everything, it was said, forgot his own abundance. There's a story passed through the generations, likely apocryphal, though fondly repeated, of a boy who once served Darius the Great. The boy was new to the palace, unsure of the customs. At the end of the feast, he reached to remove the last fig from the king's plate. The king stopped him, gently, and placed the fig instead into the boy's hand. "Eat what is left," he said. "It is where the memory lives." Whether the king spoke those words or not, the lesson remained. What is left is not lesser. You glance now at a tray holding a single slice of quince. No one reaches for it, no one rushes to clear it. It stays, for a while, bathed in firelight, quiet and complete. A guest beside you gently lifts the tray and hands it to a server, who bows slightly and carries it out, not discarded, but delivered. And still, the room remains at rest. No one fidgets, no one scrapes or stacks or sweeps. The clearing happens as if by breath, slow, natural, respectful. The practice of saving leftovers wasn't only about resourcefulness. It was about acknowledging the work that brought the food to life. The farmer, the miller, the baker, the cook, the servant, the hand that stirred the stew, the flame that kept it warm. Each bite not taken still carried their labor. And so, it was given a second life. You imagine now a cook seated by a back door, spooning the last of the stew into a small bowl, still fragrant with cinnamon. He eats quietly, without grandeur, without ceremony, and yet with a fullness that perhaps only the last spoonful can bring. Because when food is shared in circles, even quiet, unseen ones, it nourishes something deeper than the body. It affirms belonging. You sit with that thought, letting it wrap around you like a soft shawl. The idea that every meal extends beyond the table, that care moves outward, like ripples in a still pool, long after the feast is done. Even now, as the servers step lightly around you, lifting what remains with hands that never hurry, you feel the grace in it, the respect, the knowing. The fire has burned low, but it has not gone out. Its glow remains, as does the sweetness in the air, as does the sense that what is left behind is not forgotten, but carried forward. And so, you remain seated, still, full, not only of food, but of understanding. The feast continues, quietly, in the hands that carry it onward, in a hallway, in a courtyard, in a kitchen far from gold, and maybe, just maybe, in you. The room has grown quieter still, not with absence, but with fullness. The meal has passed, the dancers have vanished, the last dates have been carried away, and yet you remain, not waiting for anything, but held gently in the afterglow. You are no longer thinking about hunger or satisfaction. You are noticing something else, something smaller, something softer, the scent, not one overwhelming perfume, not one loud aroma, but a layering, a subtle mingling of sweetness, earth, smoke, and time. Even now, with the table mostly cleared, the air carries the memory of the feast in whispers of fragrance. It hums low in your lungs and rests just beneath your breath. In ancient Persia, smell was never an accident. It was a signal, a guide, a quiet language that preceded the tongue. You look around and realize that much of the meal has already been told to you through scent. The stew before it was served, the dates before they were tasted, the rice even before the lid was lifted. And now, even as nothing new is brought to the table, a new scent arrives. It does not come on a tray, it comes in the air, rosewater, just a thread of it, drifting in from the edge of the hall, carried on a faint breeze stirred by unseen movement. Someone has uncorked a vessel, not for drinking, not for cooking, but to infuse the space with memory, with closure, and that is the point. In Persian dining, scent did not simply accompany the meal, it shaped its rhythm. You could tell a course was ending not by the absence of food, but by the arrival of scent, not sudden, not strong, just present. There's a saying in one of the old texts, faintly scrawled in the corner of a scroll on banquet customs. When the tongue sleeps, the nose remembers. And so it is now. The guests, though sated, remain seated. No one rises. The lamps burn low, flickering gently. and the fragrance begins to thicken, never overpowering, only more visible to the senses. You catch hints of jasmine, a trace of orange blossom, and beneath it all, the earthy finish of burned sandalwood curling softly from a discreet brazier in the corner. You begin to understand how smell served as punctuation at Persian meals. Each transition, from savory to sweet, from feast to farewell, was signaled first not by word or gesture, but by the careful release of a chosen scent. In grand courts, this task belonged to a particular attendant, the Attar Farosh, keeper of fragrances. He was trained not in perfumes for the body, but in the balance of air. He knew which aromas soothed the belly, which revived the mind, which comforted the spirit. You picture him now, moving through the shadows with a vessel shaped like a shallow bowl, steam curling from its lip. He does not announce his presence. He is not meant to be seen. He drifts, and the scent does the speaking. Each guest responds in their own quiet way, a lowered head, a deeper breath, a soft smile. There is no discussion about the scent. To name it would be to contain it. Better to let it rise and fade on its own terms. The room becomes a kind of garden, not blooming, but remembering. The smell is not of flowers, but of what flowers leave behind in memory. It is the ghost of a feast, not its echo. You sit with it, letting it reach you, not through the tongue or stomach, but through the softest corner of your senses. And here's the curious part. Smell was sometimes more than custom. It was instruction. In certain regions, a distinct aroma was used to indicate the pace of the meal. If mint was burned, it meant the course would end soon, time to slow your chewing, to take smaller bites. If cloves were released, it signaled that conversation might resume. If myrrh appeared, all speech was to stop. The meal was shifting toward its final silence. You wonder what signals drift through your world now. Do your meals have such cues? Do your spaces tell you, gently, when to rest, when to speak, when to simply breathe? In this Persian hall, you begin to understand. Fragrance is time. It is a clock with no numbers, a bell with no chime. You follow it not because you must, but because it feels like remembering. There's a tale of Queen Atossa, daughter of Cyrus, who refused to eat until the scent of hyacinth filled her chambers. She claimed the flower gave her clarity, and that without it, even the richest dishes tasted dull. Whether that was true or not, historians still debate. But to this day, the first breath of hyacinth in early spring is still called the Queen's Arrival in some villages. You let the stories mix with the scents now, rose and memory, spice and story, and still, the room does not move. A server returns, not with food, but with a damp cloth steeped in herbs, basil, thyme, a trace of vinegar. Each guest receives one, folded neatly on a plate. They lift the cloths to their faces, inhale once, then rest them across their hands, not to wipe, to breathe. This is the last act of the meal. A closing sigh. The herbs clear the tongue, settle the stomach, and gently prepare the body for sleep or speech, whichever comes next. Even this, even now, smells like something ancient. The lamps flicker lower. You feel the difference in the light, not darker, exactly, just quieter. The flame no longer dances. It leans. You sit still, the cloth in your lap, the scent brushing the edges of your breath. Nothing is left to taste, but everything is still to be remembered. You understand now why smell mattered so much, because long after the dishes are cleared, long after the guests have gone, long after the night turns toward morning, the memory of the feast will remain in the air, in the folds of fabric, in the hair of the dancers, in the stones of the hall, and in you. The scent lingers, low and warm, like breath on cooled stone, around you. The air has shifted, no longer fragrant with fruit or smoke, but with something older, something quieter, a stillness that isn't silence, a hush that isn't empty. The cloth in your lap holds the fading ghost of herbs. The flames lean lower, shadows stretch longer. The feast, it seems, has stepped aside. And now the sacred begins to arrive, not with fanfare, not with ceremony, but with a whisper and a flicker of fire. In the far corner of the room, one small lamp remains untouched, smaller than the rest, brighter, too. Its flame doesn't sway with the others. It burns steady, not showy, not wild, just deeply there, like a thought that never leaves. You hadn't noticed it before. That's how it wants it. This flame does not heat food. It doesn't guide servers or warm guests. It simply exists. And in ancient Persia, that was more than enough, because this was no ordinary light. This was the fire of Ahura Mazda, the eternal flame, the sacred spark of Zoroastrian belief, placed at the edge of the feast not to bless the food, but to remind the soul. You sit with it now, not too close, but close enough to feel its meaning. Zoroastrianism, the ancient faith of Persia, held fire as a symbol of truth, of purity, not a god itself, but a mirror of the divine, a constant flickering thread between this world and something unseen. And even at banquets, especially at banquets, it had its place. Not front and center, not demanding attention, just there, quiet, patient, watching. There's a passage, half preserved in the Gathas, the oldest Zoroastrian hymns, that speaks of truth that flickers but never fades. It is thought to refer to fire, though no one can say for certain. Scholars have debated its meaning for centuries, but those who lit lamps at meals never needed to. They knew the fire spoke in ways no verse could. You watch now as a servant approaches the sacred lamp, not to adjust it, not to trim or stir, only to kneel, hands folded, head lowered, not worship, reverence. Then they rise and walk away. No announcement, no pause in the room, and yet something in the air deepens. The guests remain seated, their eyes soft, their posture quiet. The flame holds the space now, not just physical space, spiritual space, a space where gratitude might settle, where thoughts left unspoken during the meal might rise and dissolve, where the difference between fullness and meaning becomes a little clearer. You wonder if anyone at this table prays aloud. You suspect not. Here, prayer doesn't need voice. It needs breath, attention, a moment of stillness beneath a flame that refuses to flicker. It's said that before every great Persian feast, a small prayer was offered to the fire, not to ask, but to affirm, to say, "We see you," to say, "We are still learning how to be good." You breathe that thought now, not because you were taught it, but because it feels right. In some traditions, a sliver of the first bread was held near the flame before being eaten, not burned, not offered, just introduced, as if to say, this, too, is part of the order. In others, the flame was given its own table, a low stone pedestal with no food, no plate, only light, and it was enough. Even the layout of the dining hall, you begin to suspect, was shaped by fire. Guests seated to allow the glow to reach their faces, dishes arranged so that no shadow crossed the sacred flame, movements designed not to pass in front of it. There's a legend, rarely told outside the old temples, of a king who forgot to include the sacred lamp at a victory feast. The meal went forward. The guests laughed. The stew was perfect. But the next morning, the king said he felt hollow, that the feast had fed his hunger, but not his soul. The next time, the flame returned. You sit now in that old lesson, not judged, not instructed, just reminded, because this is what the fire does. It reminds, of the unseen hands that made the meal, of the forgotten names that came before, of the earth that gave the grain, and the sky that gave the rain. You notice how the guests do not stare at the flame. They do not point or gesture, but their bodies lean subtly toward it, some in posture, some in breath, as if drawn to something without needing to name it. You think of your own life now, the moments you've eaten without pausing, spoken without tasting, hurried through sweetness without noticing the scent it left behind, and now, here, in the presence of this small, steady flame, you feel time stretch, you feel your body settle, you feel your mind quiet enough to hear the silence beneath it. The fire does not preach. It does not glow with special colors. It just is, constant, ancient, pure. And in its presence, so are you. A guest now reaches into their pocket and produces a small vial, not of oil, but of incense. Gently, they offer it to a servant, who nods once, then steps toward the flame and releases a single drop onto the coals. The scent rises, slow and curling. Frankincense, perhaps. Or myrrh, something resinous, something that smells like old wisdom and soft endings. The room does not change. It simply listens. The flame absorbs the offering and returns nothing but light. And that is enough. You breathe in. The feast is behind you. The sweetness has faded. The scent has softened. But the flame remains. A witness, a teacher, a quiet, glowing presence that asks only this: remember. And you do. The flame flickers in place, calm and steady, and around it the world seems to soften further. The meal is behind you now, not forgotten, but folded neatly into memory. The hush of the hall has deepened into something more than silence, something sacred, still. You remain seated, still. You breathe, each inhale touched faintly by incense and recollection. And then, the shift. It begins as a breath of movement at the far end of the room. Nothing loud, nothing sudden, just a change, subtle, as if the air itself has remembered something else. You see the doors open wider than before, not to serve, but to release. A handful of servants re-enter, not bearing trays, not tending flames, but moving with purpose, their expression softer than before. Behind them, musicians. You hadn't seen them all evening. They have been waiting, patient, nearly invisible. They begin to play. And the first note tells you something is different, not wild, not festive, just unexpected. A string instrument, low and humming, a frame drum, gentle as heartbeat, a flute, soft as wind. Together, they form a melody unlike the quiet that's come before. Then the doors open wider still, and with them, laughter, real laughter, light and spontaneous, like water over polished stone. From where, you're not sure, but it spills into the hall like an invitation. And suddenly, people are standing, not all at once, not quickly, but rising, stretching limbs, letting shawls fall from shoulders, exchanging glances that hold something new. The rule has changed, and in ancient Persia, when that happened, it meant only one thing. This was the night of Yekabul Khandan, the feast of one exception. Once every season, once at most, a royal or noble household would host a feast not bound by the usual code, a night where formality gave way to freedom, where the rules that shaped elegance were gently unbuttoned, not abandoned, just loosened. Like the final note of a song humming into play, tonight is that night. Guests begin to move freely now. A woman steps over a cushion to sit beside a friend. A young man, perhaps a poet, perhaps only bold, refills the king's cup without a summons. And the king, he smiles, broadly, eyes crinkled with something close to joy. Because the point of Yek Kabul Khandan was not to forget the rules, but to remember that they were human. The musicians swell their notes slightly, still gentle, still sleep soft, but now carrying rhythm. And the servers, they are laughing too, not mocking, just sharing. One tosses a piece of flatbread to another across the hall. It's caught mid-air. A gasp, then applause, real, free, playful. You find yourself smiling. This, too, was part of the design. One night to remember that joy belongs at the table. Not just dignity, not just reverence, but laughter, lightness, loosened seams. It is said that this tradition began during the reign of Artaxerxes the First, when after a year of war and austerity, he hosted a feast with no ceremony and served his generals himself. The moment was so disarming, so human, that it softened old grudges and mended quiet wounds. Ever since, the practice lived on, scattered through time, appearing only when most needed. Historians still argue whether the tale is symbolic, whether the king truly served, or whether he merely stood. But it doesn't matter. The story fed the tradition, and the tradition fed the people. You watch now as a guest breaks the last cookie in half and offers it to a stranger. Someone takes a sip from the wrong bowl, and no one minds. Another begins to hum. The flame in the corner continues to burn, but even it seems to flicker with mirth. The room, once ruled by careful steps and quiet glances, now dances with unscripted motion, not chaos, not noise, just release. The kind that only makes sense after deep stillness. And then, a new scent, apples, steamed with cinnamon, not on trays, but in open bowls passed from hand to hand. A final course, or a gift, no one knows, no one asks, it simply moves. Someone drops a spoon, it clatters, and no one flinches. That is how you know. The feast has turned, not ended, turned. There's another story, whispered by those who worked in palace kitchens, that the most beautiful dish of the night was always saved for Yek Kabul Khandan, not for show, not for praise, but for freedom. A dish made not to impress, but to delight. Often something odd, a stew with wild flowers, rice dyed blue with crushed indigo, a sweet made from roasted lentils and sugar, not traditional, not expected, but honest, joyful, and always served with bare hands. You wonder what dish will appear tonight, or if it already has. Perhaps the joy is the dish. Perhaps the smile from the guest beside you is sweeter than quince. You watch now as two elders begin a game, some kind of silent competition with folded napkins and glances. A group nearby tries to mimic the flute's melody with their own breath. It sounds ridiculous, and beautiful, and the king. He leans back on his cushion, his robe loose at the shoulder, his laughter silent but full. No speeches tonight, just presence. You close your eyes for a moment, and in the dark behind your eyelids, you feel the pulse of the room like a heartbeat made of warm sound and soft motion. This feast, so rich in rules, in grace, in silence, now floats free for one night, not to undo what came before, but to complete it, to remind each person here that tradition must bend, sometimes, so that the heart remembers how to feel. You open your eyes again, and the lamplight shimmers a little softer. The air smells of apples and ash and joy. And somehow, without quite knowing how, you realize this too is part of the ritual, a moment of permission. A rule made to be broken, gently, joyfully, together. And now, the light has changed again, not suddenly, not like the snap of a door or the extinguishing of a candle, but slowly, like steam curling from a bowl left to cool, like the final chords of music that stretch long into silence. The laughter still echoes faintly, soft, sincere, and brief. A few last murmurs glide across the hall, but even they begin to slow, as if the room itself is ready to exhale. The feast of one exception has run its gentle course. The rules were lifted, the laughter shared, and now, like all beautiful things, it begins to settle into memory. You remain seated. Your limbs feel heavier now, not from fatigue, but from a kind of softness that spreads from inside out. The kind of softness that only comes after being fully present, fully nourished, not just with food, but with attention, with rhythm, with meaning. A few guests are rising now, but there is no rush. Some stand and stretch their arms overhead. Others wrap shawls around shoulders and exchange quiet glances. The musicians are packing their instruments, slowly, reverently, as if even the silence deserves accompaniment. The fire, once tall and unwavering, now leans low in its vessel. Its last flickers stretch upward with grace, then fall gently back. You watch it breathe, one last time, before it dims to a red, glowing hush. And just like that, the feast ends. No one announces it, no bell rings, no decree is made. The end comes naturally, like dusk folding into night, like a lullaby finishing not with a flourish, but with a long, soft sigh. You remain for just a moment longer, listening not for sound, but for stillness. Because here, in the Persian tradition, endings are not abrupt. They are transitions, gentle, gradual, and always with intention. The space around you is no longer a dining hall. It has become something else, a space for reflection, for digestion, not only of flavors, but of feeling. The lamps are slowly extinguished, one by one. A servant passes, and you notice he no longer moves with urgency. His shoulders have relaxed, his steps are slower now, and you breathe that same rhythm, slow, even, complete. In some households, guests would sleep in the very same room where they dined, cushions pulled into beds, blankets folded nearby. The hall transformed from table to resting place with only a few motions. One kind of gathering became another. Eating became dreaming. You can almost see it. One guest settling beside the last embers of a lamp, another resting near the corner where the sacred fire still glows, dim but present. The king, perhaps, retiring through a side door, not with a procession, but alone, unnoticed, as he wished. And in that vision, you begin to feel it, the gift of slowness, the peace of endings, the sacredness of after. There is a tale, old and rarely written, of a boy who once lingered long after the final plate had been cleared. He asked a server, "Why do I feel sad when the feast ends?" The server replied, "Because it was made with love, and love leaves a softness behind." Historians don't argue that one. They know better. You sit now with that same softness. It is not sadness. It is not loss. It is completion. The kind of quiet that holds no hunger, no question, only stillness, only presence. Outside, the stars have thickened. The desert sky, deep and velvet, stretches far beyond the rooftop. If you were to rise and walk into the courtyard, you might smell the last of the spices on the wind. You might see footprints still pressed into sand from where the bread was first carried in. You might even hear, very faintly, the echo of laughter folded into stone. But you do not rise, not yet. You stay seated, breathing, remembering, letting the rhythm of the evening pass fully through you. There's a belief, more personal than official, that the feast isn't over until the last guest has remembered something they didn't know they had forgotten. A name, a scent, a stillness, a kindness, and perhaps, as you sit here now, you found yours. Maybe it was the rose in the steam. Maybe it was the spoon that never clinked. Maybe it was the way no one asked for more, yet no one left hungry. Whatever it was, It lingers now in the quiet behind your breath, not heavy, not loud, just there, like the warmth of a fire that has already gone out, but still glows beneath ash. A servant passes one last time, offering nothing, only a glance, a slight nod, a gesture that says, "You may leave now, if you wish, but also, you may stay." You smile without thinking, because the best kind of invitation is one that allows both, and so you stay. Just a little longer. The guests have gone, their footsteps soft on the stone. The servers have vanished. The dancers, the musicians, the cook who first stirred the stew, all of them folded now into the larger silence. Only you remain, and the memory of saffron and spoon, of fire and bread, of silence, laughter, and the sweetness of restraint. This has been a story, yes, but it was also a feast, and it ends not with dessert, not with applause, but with a light fading slowly across the floor. You close your eyes, let it fade, let it rest. Let it carry you now, gently, into your own stillness. Sweet dreams,